Namaste, everybody. Welcome to this talk on sort of apparent contradictions and how these contradictions can be resolved by using context in various statements about dharma. So, note that dharma is not a set of fixed commandments. It's not that you say this is a rule that is applicable universally. So, for example, there are lots of stories which say that telling the truth can lead to negative karma, especially when the truth leads to sort of killing of innocent people and so on. So, because it's not a fixed set of rules, there are general principles. They need to be made more concrete via what I call contexts. So the context provides sort of the extra information necessary to instantiate the principle so that one knows what does dharma in that particular situation or context actually means. And that is why when we look at sort of various statements, there will be apparent contradictions between different scriptures. Because again, if we view them as absolute principles, yes, they are in conflict, but actually they should not be viewed as absolute principles. So these contradictions also get resolved when you add a context to them. So in this particular talk, I will focus on three statements from the Taittiriya Upanishad: Matrudevo Bhava, Pitrudevo Bhava, and Acharya Devo Bhava. So before we get into that, let's look at sort of a very, very informal meaning. I know we can analyze these things from a very, very deep Sanskrit perspective, but that's not the purpose of this talk. We just want a general sort of understanding of the principle. So ultimately, these statements can be viewed as behave like one. So it's a suggestion or an injunction, although I don't like the word injunction because that gives the impression that it is universal. So behave like one for whom mother, father, or guru, the Matru, Pitra, and Acharya, are like God. So that means you show them the respect, you obey them, and so on. For the sake of brevity, I will refer to these statements as M, P, and A. Otherwise, every time I have to write Matsudevo Bhava, etc., and that fills up the slide. So again, so these are the three statements I will look at from the Taittiriya Upanishad and then link it to other stories from our Puranas and Mahabharata, etc., to see how there are contradictions and how these contradictions can be resolved. So let's consider P, which is Pitrudeva Bhava. So clearly, Prahlad, does he violate P? That is, does he not obey his father? Obviously, that is indeed the case. But is this violation justified? All of us will agree, yes, it is justified. Prahlad was justified in disobeying Hiranyakashipu because Hiranyakashipu, in our opinion, was wrong. But it still goes against the fact that Prahlad violated the principle P from the Taittiriya Upanishad. So if this is the case, then should P be removed from the Taittiriya Upanishad? Because clearly it is false. It's not applicable to Prahlada. So who knows where all it is applicable and where all it is not. Now, of course, we'll all say, no, 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 it cannot be removed from the Taittiriya Upanishad, so we need to resolve it. So how do we resolve the story of Prahlada disobeying his father, Hiranyakashipu, and the principle expressed in the Taittiriya Upanishad? So that is where, as I said, add some context to it. So for example, let's say we change P to P prime, which says that if your father has your well-being in mind, and note that is, I put it in parentheses, just to show that that is the context for this particular situation, then follow P, right? So if the father has one's well-being, then one follows P. And this caters for the situation where fathers don't always have the well-being of the children, right? Oops. So in this particular case, Hiranyakashipu was more interested in his own ego and he did not care about Prahlada, and was Prahlada worshipping Vishnu? Was that good for Prahlada? Was not the concern. He said, hey, I am the greatest and latest, so you better worship me. So one can conclude that this precondition, if your father has your well being in mind, was false. Therefore, Prahlada does not violate P, because the whole P prime requires that your father has to have your well being in mind for you to follow P. So, again, I hope this shows that by a very, very simple example what a context looks like. So, here the Pitra Deva Bhava from the Taittiya Upanishad is resolved in the case of Prahlada by saying that Hiranyakashipu did not have Prahlada's well being in his mind. So now let's consider M, Matra Deva Bhava. And if you look at the Ramayana, when Kaikeyi wanted Rama to be banished to the forests, um, uh, Dasharatha obviously wanted him to go to the forest because that's the vow he had given to Kaikeyi. But Kausalya did not want Rama to go to the forest. So now, again, we can say, look, M prime, we can put a context. If your mother has your well being in mind, then follow M. Note that it is not possible for Rama to follow both P prime and M prime, because obviously he'll have to violate one of them by going to the forest. So the question is, how can we resolve that? So clearly, Rama violates P prime from a very, very narrow definition of well being, because when Dasharatha asks him to go, he does not have Rama's immediate material well being in mind. He's more worried about the vow he has given to Kaikeyi and so on. So, from that very, very narrow definition, he does not have that, but we would not agree with that very, very narrow definition. Rama violates M prime as Kausalya wanted Rama to disobey Dasharatha. So obviously she had Rama's immediate well-being in mind, material well-being in mind. So obviously he should have followed his mother's advice of not going to the forest and thereby disobeying Dasharatha. So, but again, we'll all agree that what Rama did was indeed the right thing from a dharma point of view. So the question is, what should the context be in this case? So here we can have an in-depth discussion, and in this particular talk, I won't really go into depth, and that can be left as a discussion afterwards. So essentially, we have to relate it to attachment and greater good. It was Kausalya's attachment to Rama that led her to advise Rama to disobey Dasharatha. Note that I'm not saying Dasharatha was not attached to Rama, he was. But he was thinking about the greater good of the kingdom and ultimately Rama's legitimacy as king. So, for example, if Rama had disobeyed Dasharatha, not gone to the forest and become king, maybe people would have said, hey, what sort of king is he? Is he legitimate? He disobeyed his father and so on. So, Rama's then legacy gets undermined, right? So the context should be that, what is the greater good? What is long term? And are you motivated by short term attachments and so on? So clearly, you can have such a context for M and P, so that you can resolve the apparent contradiction between what Kausalya wanted and what Dasharatha wanted for Rama to do. Right? So clearly, those two statements taken at face value, where Kausalya says, don't go to the forest, and Dasharatha says, go to the forest, is contradictory. But then, by attaching suitable context and by attaching suitable references to what is attachment and greater good is not only for Rama but also for the kingdom, we can actually resolve that particular situation. So now the final one I want to consider is Acharya Devabhava. So consider Drona, who sided with the Kauravas, but Drona was also the Pandavas' guru. He taught them everything. So again, you wouldn't fight God, right? Since A says, treat your guru as if they are God, then is it wrong of the Pandavas to fight Drona? Again, we will say, look, it was Drona who decided to side with the Kauravas for whatever reason. So, and the Pandavas had no choice. But nonetheless, if we consider the principle without context, the Pandavas were wrong to fight Drona. So the question again is, as I said, how to add a context to A to make this particular situation compatible with what the Taittiriya Upanishad says. So note that here the well-being, etc., still doesn't come into play like it did in the case of Rama and Kausalya and Dashratha. Drona still had all his students' well-being at heart. I mean, so uh, he wanted the Pandavas to thrive. He wanted the Kauravas to thrive. The only reason he chose the Kaurava side is because of a sense of obligation. So he felt he was obliged to fight with the Kauravas because they had given him a job when he was poor, and all his wealth and etc. was because of the throne. I mean, not the Kauravas themselves, but the throne, basically Bhishma hiring him. So he wanted to, like Bhishma, fight for the throne. So now this is where the context can be okay, do you obey versus respect, right? The Pandavas respected Drona, but they are not going to obey him blindly. So essentially, the context is, okay, you respect your guru, treat them like God, but don't obey them because, you have to make up your mind as to whether you're going to fight them or not, depending on the situation you are in. And this leads to actually a very interesting point about should one be God fearing or God respecting. So when one fears God, one just blindly obeys God, and unfortunately, at least when I was growing up, that was the nature of God explained. Oh, you better do this, otherwise God will get angry, and so on. Now that I'm older, I find such a God is very very petty. Why should they get angry if I decide to do something else? So essentially, the God fearing aspect leads to all these injunctions, as I said, which are not very, very satisfactory. That is why you are allowed to respect them, but you are also allowed to disagree with them. So I think respecting somebody is good, and you're allowed to disagree, right? And all of us, when we have grown up, we have disagreed with our parents, our elders, and so on. But I think most of us have disagreed, and most of the time in a very, very respectful manner. So, by putting a context of respect versus obey, you can actually say that the Pandavas fighting their Guru Drona does not violate the Acharya Devo Bhava statement made in the Taittiriya Upanishad. So hopefully, this very, very short presentation using three very, very simple examples, three very well-known examples, illustrate the fact that dharma is very, very contextual, and the contradictions can be resolved by modifying the statement with suitable context, which then is applicable to that particular situation. And again, I hopefully these three stories have shown that how one instantiate the context depends on the story, the situation, and what is the message one wants to give. Now, there may be people who may want to instantiate different contexts, and that can be a debate. And is that contextual interpretation right or wrong? But the fact is that any interpretation of dharma in a particular situation needs context. So I conclude again this very, very short presentation by saying that every statement in the Hindu scriptures has some implied context. I say implied because these contexts are never written explicitly because they depend on the situation. And that's what they say dharma has to be instantiated for basically the time and place where it is being applied. So no single context will work for every statement. So you need to analyze the situation to create the context for each statement and understand why the general principle was made. Why was the statement in the Taittiriya Upanishad made? That's a general principle, and indeed, as a very, very general aspirational principle, that's a very good one. But we need to differentiate the general principles from specific applications. So again, the general principles omit the context, but we have to reinsert the context when we interpret dharma. And a classic example, which I have not discussed here, but I think is again a good discussion point for others, is the statement in the Mahabharata which says ahimsa paramo dharma. So ahimsa paramo dharma, if that is the case, why fight, why have a war and so on. But as Bhishma points out to Yudhishthira, that okay, but you have to punish the wicked. Otherwise, you're punishing the innocent by not punishing the wicked. So then either way, you're not doing justice to the statement ahimsa paramo dharma. So ahimsa paramo dharma applies only when people are well behaved, but if people are not well behaved, then the principle of ahimsa does not apply. Right? So that's another example where this notion of context can be done. So again, thanks very much for listening. I'll greatly appreciate any comments you have. But hopefully, with this very short talk, I have illustrated the point of the need for context to resolve dharmic dilemmas. Thank you very much. Namaste.